Okay, so we start our main event of Bike AI 2020 with the talk of Leonard Zigerius entitled Modeling Metaplasticity and Memory Reconsolidation During an EMDR Treatment. Please, Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to this presentation. Today I will present to you the study I did together with Professor Jan Treur, who is also in this call. In this study, we created a model that represents relevant events in the psychological and neurological domain during EMDR treatment. And we represent the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. First of all, a little incentive for this study. EMDR is the result of desperation in quick, efficient, and cost-free, or relatively cost-free trauma therapy. Luckily, this was invented because in a given year, around 8 million people in the United States have PTSD. So what is EMDR? I assume that many people know or heard about it at least once. As this slide reads, it is a psychotherapy treatment that was designed to alleviate the stress associated with traumatic memories. There are many very clear videos on YouTube and the internet. If you don't know about EMDR, I recommend watching these. They are much better at explaining than I can do in a shorter time. So why would we model the effects of this therapy? EMDR therapy seems to evoke a pathway that shows interesting neuro and psychopathological occurrences. Attention, working memory, memorization, and stress are interesting domains affected by EMDR therapy. As it says, EMDR therapy might relearn how to deploy attention and re-evaluate sensory evidence from the memorized narrative, so it can really rewrite your memory. By suppressing the bodily reaction to memorization, such as stress, regulation is improved. I will go over the main brain areas. First, there's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This area mediates dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and amygdala connections, which is used in emotion regulation. Secondly, in any emotion regulation modeling thing, the amygdala cannot be missed. This area is not only relevant for emotions, it shows a very specific activity during fear responses. So in extinction learning of fear responses, it is smart to include this in our model. Thirdly, there is the dorsal frontoparietal network, which is active during working memory tasks and is deliberately activated by eye movement intervention. This area is, among other things, highly involved in concentration. And of course, the visual processing system plays a role, and stress is, among others, the initiator of resource competition. It's not just stress, it's actually the EMDR therapy that triggers this competition, but stress is the thing that really starts the battle, so to speak. So this is a graphical representation of the occurring resource competition. So EMDR starts and these events occur. I will go over them. First of all, in this diagram, the amygdala represents negative emotional activity and autobiographical memory recollection represents the recollection of traumatic memories. First, during memory recollection, stress and traumatic memories engage the amygdala and thus use brain resources. As we all know, it's not easy to relive tough memories and/or experience stress. However, because eye movements engage the dorsal frontoparietal network and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, resource competition occurs. The dorsal frontoparietal network and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, they require brain resources, and with this theory, the amygdala loses its resources and is thus downregulated. Interestingly, the competition becomes even more complex. Two special things happen. The stress that arises in turn impairs the dorsal frontoparietal network, causing the inhibiting power to reduce, and the traumatic memory needs to be fully experienced in order to be properly reconsolidated. But ventromedial prefrontal cortex activation reduces the emotionality and vividness of these memories. This may be the reason why EMDR is not a one-time fix, but usually lasts a couple of months at least till you really get results. The metaplasticity part of this study. So secondly, there's that. Metaplasticity is, as many of you know, the plasticity of synaptic plasticity. This decides the extent in which synaptic plasticity can occur. In the hippocampus, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, is known to support neuronal function and survival. Stress or depression can decrease the hippocampal expression of BDNF, thereby blocking synaptic plasticity. A very nice study done by René Garcia explains how in the hippocampus, long-lasting changes in synaptic strength are prevented by long-term depression and vice versa. According to Garcia, metaplasticity can be either negative or positive, named with respect to their influence on cognitive functioning. Positive metaplasticity is achieved by increasing BDNF levels, for example, using EMDR treatment, which is restorative for impaired cognitive functions. Negative metaplasticity represents the shift in synaptic plasticity that occurs due to decreasing levels of BDNF in the hippocampus and is symptomized by impaired cognitive functions such as learning. This also causes fear extinction learning to not happen that easily. So quickly, I'll go over the modeling objectives. So the model needs to represent how the person regulates stress, that there are recursive internal body loops. The model needs to show the results of fear extinction learning. The model needs to show memory reconsolidation, meaning the toxicity of the memory is gone. So reoccurring flashbacks do not trigger the same emotionality. The applied techniques for this in this study are the temporal causal network modeling approach. For more information on this approach, I highly recommend you to check out the work done by my co-author Jan Treur. Also, adaptivity is modeled using work done by Jan Treur, namely using network reification. Reification states are added for adaptive connections and adaptive speed factors using first and second order adaptive states. And Happy learning is applied with the famous quote, neurons that fire together wire together, which is important for long-term synaptic changes. So this is the model. In the paper itself, it's of course more explained. Right now, I will only show you globally how it works. And in the next slide, I will go over the simulation. In this model, you can see how plasticity and metaplasticity are important for executive states, such as feeling, preparation of bodily feeling, and control states. So the states PS, oh, there's the thing. If I use the pointer, the PS, CS, and behind this thing, the FS, which are the feeling states, preparation states, and control states, they are basically plastic and are controlled by metaplasticity and plasticity. The blue arrows indicate causal connections, and the pink arrows downward causal connections. I will go over the simulation now. So it's never nice to look at a picture with all those lines with no clear indication. So I will go over it hopefully a bit clearly. So first, there are two sensory states for the traumatic event and the trigger of the traumatic memory. This happened in a person's life, so it exists. These are not yet the representation states of the person or the trauma. This means that these states are readily available because, well, they happened. The representation states of EMDR therapy only happens a specific time of the simulation, from about time 60 to time 150. During this period, a shift in metaplasticity must happen and a research competition will occur. Now, as the sensory representation state of EMDR is rising, which is the orange line, the preparation state and feeling states are dropping in their intensity. The high feeling and preparation states represent a very stressful state, which caused negative metaplasticity. In the simulation, you can now see that when this stress is reduced, metaplasticity shifts back to positive. These two dotted lines. Now, regular plasticity allows fear extinction learning, and the feeling state remains low with the rising of the first order adaptive states, which are plasticity, and the increasing control state, which helps emotion regulation. And lastly, over time, the awareness state, which says for itself is the awareness of the trauma, and the traumatic representation state, which is the representation of the trauma, which, for example, occurs using a trigger, they start to fade away. This is because time heals, of course, many wounds, and eventually influence of the traumatic re-experience drops. It is also good to mention that even if the preparation state shows activity, this is not paired with negative feeling, which means that the trauma can be re-experienced, but in a less toxic way. Lastly, I will propose some research that has been done that can be an extension for the model used in this study. In my opinion, it's a good idea to continue researching clinical differences in EMDR. Differences in working memory taxation can evoke different responses, which can also be modeled. There are many brain regions that show interesting activity during EMDR, which are also very interesting to model. For example, in the hippocampus, there's a resetting of the pacemaker cells in the setup. In the cerebellum, there are specific processes, and the thalamus shows increased thalamic activity, which is different from regular visual working memory taxation. Also, the model can be extended with a rather special phenomenon. This phenomenon occurs when individuals periodically look away during conversations. It is hypothesized that they actively search for visual fields with no useful information to improve long-term memory and episodic recall. Also, it is shown that restriction of eye movement impairs memory performance, and eye movement showed improvements over other regular working memory tasks, such as tapping or counting or listening to taps, for example, metronome. This is, in my opinion, interesting as further research for this. Lastly, the model can be extended with scientific findings on REM sleep, namely the rhythmic theory of attention. This means that data rhythms, which are clocking in the brain, they systematically reassess incoming information. And it's found that eye movements reset this rhythm. And interestingly, the theta rhythms play a large role in memory consolidation, information organization, and it's found that REM sleep uses these theta rhythms as well. I uploaded the slides to EasyChair, so if you're interested in anything, you can have a look at the references I mentioned. And that was my presentation. Are there any questions?